They slammed him against his own front door, keys still hanging from the lock, accusing him of breaking into the house he paid for in cash. The neighborhood froze. Sprinklers hissed in the distance, and a child's bike lay forgotten on the lawn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. But in his silence, there was a storm. Every question they barked at him was soaked in assumption, and every answer he gave only seemed to make them angrier. They didn't see the calm authority in his eyes or the quiet pain behind it. All they saw was color, the kind that, to them, meant guilt. The flashing red and blue lights painted his skin in distortion, turning peace into chaos and misunderstanding into violence. They didn't ask whose name was on the deed. They didn't care that his car was in the driveway, or that the welcome mat beneath his feet had his family's initials stitched into it. To them, he didn't belong there. It was the quiet certainty in his composure that bothered them. The kind of confidence that didn't fit their narrative. The louder they got, the calmer he became, and that calm drove them mad. He'd seen this before. On the streets, in the headlines, in the whispers of those who swore they weren't racist but acted like fear was a badge of honor. Tonight, that fear had a uniform. One of them circled behind him, hand hovering over his holster. The other barked for ID he'd already shown. He thought about his family photos inside, about the framed certificates on the hallway wall that told the story of everything he'd earned. Yet none of it mattered out here. Out here, he was just a silhouette under suspicion. He swallowed the urge to shout, to fight, to demand the respect he deserved. Instead, he let silence speak. A weapon sharper than rage, colder than fear. When one officer grabbed his wrist, time slowed. Every injustice he'd ever survived replayed in fragments. Each echo of "stop resisting." Each flash of disbelief that dignity could be mistaken for defiance. But this time felt different. Not because he was powerless, but because he wasn't. He knew something they didn't. Something that would flip their world upside down before the night was over. So he took a breath, met their eyes, and let the moment unfold. The neighborhood watched from windows and porches, hearts pounding in unison. No one spoke. The tension wasn't just about what was happening. It was about what it revealed. In a world where justice wore a badge, tonight the badge was blind. And yet, beneath that storm of ignorance, the man's silence carried a quiet promise. Truth was coming, and when it arrived, it wouldn't need sirens to be heard. The tension thickened as the street fell silent, except for the hum of engines and the low hiss of radio chatter. The man stood tall, his voice steady but firm, explaining once more that this was his home. Every word, measured and precise, landed like a challenge to their authority. The officers exchanged glances, one gripping his belt, the other adjusting his stance, ready for a confrontation he couldn't justify. Neighbors' cameras began to glow in the dark, the blue and red lights flickering across lenses like restless ghosts. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspeakable. The weight of history pressing down on the present. They asked him where he got the keys. He told them again. They didn't believe him. Every repetition became an accusation. Every explanation twisted into defiance. He saw it in their eyes, the moment reason gave way to fear. That ancient reflex of mistrust that turned men into enforcers and truth into noise. He raised his hand slowly, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. As if to say, I've done this dance too many times before. The younger officer's voice cracked as he barked commands, unsure whether to dominate or de-escalate. The man stayed silent, studying him, not with hatred, but with the sadness of someone who's seen the same mistake replayed across generations. The other officer stepped forward, hand grazing his weapon. It wasn't about the crime. There was no crime. It was about control. The desperate need to remind him who supposedly had it. He spoke softly now, each word deliberate, like a sermon to ears that refused to listen. He told them he worked for the department, that they were making a mistake. The skeptical officer laughed, called it a good story. The other hesitated, glancing at his partner with unease. The irony hung heavy in the air, authority questioning itself without realizing it. Every second stretched longer than the last, and still no one blinked. When he reached for his phone to show proof, the world snapped. They lunged as if the gesture itself was a threat. The device flew from his hand, clattering across the porch. His body hit the concrete, breath stolen from his chest. The sound of metal on bone echoed louder than reason. For a moment, the lights, the voices, the sirens, all blurred into chaos. But somewhere in that noise, a truth was waiting, patient and unbothered, ready to rise. The sound of the cuffs clicked like thunder against his wrists. The officer's breathing was loud, frantic, like they were chasing danger that never existed. He lay still, face pressed to cold concrete, the smell of dust and iron filling his lungs. No fight, no struggle, just disbelief that dignity could be stripped this easily on one's own doorstep. Somewhere in the distance, the neighbor's phone captured it all, the lens shaking with fear and outrage. The street, once quiet, now pulsed with injustice, echoing with the weight of too many similar nights that had ended in silence. He whispered again that they were making a mistake, but they didn't hear him, or didn't want to. To them, his calm was defiance, his silence an accusation. One officer checked his ID, lips twisting when the address matched the house. Still, pride wouldn't let go. It was easier to double down than to admit wrong. They pulled him up roughly, wiping sweat from their brows, pretending the truth wasn't staring them in the face. As they led him toward the squad car, the phone they knocked from his hand vibrated across the porch. The caller ID glowed faintly in the chaos. "Incoming call! Captain J. Harris." The name blinked against the darkness like a flare in the fog. One officer noticed, hesitated, his grip loosening. The name meant something. It should have meant everything, but arrogance made him look away, pretending not to see. Seconds later, the phone answered itself on speaker, and a deep, commanding voice filled the night. "Who the hell am I speaking to?" The voice thundered through the phone's speaker, slicing through the tension like a blade. The officers froze, glancing at each other. "This is Captain Harris," the voice continued, "and you have my chief in handcuffs." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the radios seemed to die out, afraid to break it. The man lifted his head slightly, eyes locked on theirs. Not with vengeance, but with the quiet authority of truth revealed. The younger officer stumbled backward, whispering something inaudible. The older one reached for his keys, fumbling with trembling hands to unlock the cuffs. Every ounce of arrogance drained from their faces, replaced by raw, cold panic. The man stood slowly, dusting himself off without a word. The only sound was the metallic rattle of the cuffs being removed. Then he looked at them. No rage, no triumph, just the unbearable calm of someone who'd seen this story too many times and refused to let it end the same way. The silence after the truth hit was deafening. The two officers stood motionless, every ounce of certainty draining from their faces as the weight of their mistake sank in. The man, no longer just a suspect in their eyes, straightened his jacket, his movements deliberate, controlled, dignified. One of them stammered an apology that got lost in his throat. The other stared at the ground, wishing to disappear into the pavement. The night air seemed colder, now sharper, slicing through their pride. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew this moment would live forever in the glare of 1,000 screens. He walked toward his phone, each step echoing like a verdict. The call was still open, the captain's voice distant but furious on the other end. Without breaking eye contact, he picked up the phone, pressed it to his ear, and spoke with calm authority. "It's handled," he said simply. The officers realized then that they hadn't just humiliated an innocent man. They disrespected the very leader who commanded their department. Power shifted instantly. They were no longer in control. They were exposed, naked beneath the light of truth. The younger officer took a shaky step forward, trying to explain himself, but the man raised a single hand. A silent command that froze him mid-word. There was no shouting, no revenge, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, controlled disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand. In that moment, the man's silence was the loudest thing in the world. It told them everything. That their fear had betrayed them. That their training meant nothing without humanity, and that some lessons come only through humiliation. He told them to leave. His voice was calm but final, like the sound of a door closing on arrogance itself. They hesitated, unsure whether to apologize again or simply vanish into the dark. "Go," he repeated, and they did, backing away slowly, their boots heavy on the wet pavement. The red and blue lights began to fade, swallowed by the night, leaving behind only the sound of rain and the heartbeat of a neighborhood that had just witnessed something unforgettable. When the last engine hum disappeared, he stood alone on his porch, the silence now his. The rain eased into a mist, and for a moment, the world felt suspended between anger and grace. He looked at the house, the same one they'd tried to take from him moments earlier, and smiled faintly. Not out of triumph, but out of knowing. Because power, when wielded with restraint, is the purest form of justice. And tonight, he had chosen to remind the world that dignity doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand its ground. By dawn, the video had already made its way through every screen in the city. No caption was needed, just a few seconds of footage showing arrogance crumble beneath truth. The world didn't see uniforms or ranks. It saw the raw anatomy of prejudice unraveling in real time. Inside his home, the man watched it once, then turned off the screen. He didn't need validation. He had lived it. But somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. Justice wasn't revenge. It was accountability, and that he intended to deliver with precision. By mid-morning, the department was chaos. Phones rang off the hook, reporters camped outside headquarters, and reputations began to unravel faster than any cover story could form. The two officers sat in silence, pale and trembling, waiting for the summons they knew was coming. They weren't just facing suspension. They were about to face the man they'd handcuffed. Their hearts pounded not from fear of punishment, but from the unbearable shame of knowing who they'd humiliated. When the door opened, they didn't look up. His footsteps echoed across the tiled floor. Steady, controlled, unhurried. The air shifted as he entered, not from anger, but from authority that needed no introduction. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You both know what you did," he said quietly. "And you know why it happened." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, they saw him not as a man they'd arrested, but as the man they answered to. He could have destroyed them. With a single order, their careers could have ended before lunch. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke about restraint, the same kind they had failed to show. "You don't fix hatred with humiliation," he said. "You fix it by making people see what it costs." The words sank like stones in water. Every syllable felt heavier than the silence that followed. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They knew it wasn't theirs to have. Before he left, he placed 2 files on the table. Training orders. No punishment. No termination. Just education. "You'll learn," he said. "And then you'll teach others not to repeat your mistakes." It wasn't mercy. It was reform. Because real power isn't measured by how hard you strike back, but by how deeply you choose to heal. As he walked away, the officers sat in silence, broken but changed, realizing that the man they'd tried to shame had just taught them the meaning of true command. The video continued to spread. Its shockwaves felt from City Hall to the local diner. People gathered in small groups, sharing the footage with whispers of disbelief, anger, and surprise. Some had seen it as a simple case of police overreach. Others saw it as the latest in a long line of systemic failures that wouldn't be addressed unless everyone stood up and said enough. In quiet corners and loud rallies, the man's name became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of justice, of standing firm in the face of inequity. He turned an act of humiliation into a movement, and the ripples were only just beginning. By the time the man returned to his office the following week, the department had already begun to change. There were meetings, policy revisions, and intense discussions about accountability. He stood at the door of his office, listening to the bustle of his staff. His staff. The same officers who had once been afraid of him now looked up with respect, hesitation, and gratitude. He didn't have to remind them of their duty. They already knew. And as they filed in, he didn't see subordinates. He saw people who had learned. The younger officer, once so full of bravado, now sat in the back of the room, quietly listening. His partner, the one who had hesitated, sat closer to the front, taking notes. They had both learned that authority came with responsibility, and that their job wasn't about imposing fear, but about protecting the vulnerable, even when they didn't look like you. There was still work to be done, but it was a beginning. And as the meeting started, the room settled into an uncomfortable but necessary quiet, a quiet that spoke of understanding and accountability. Across town, the neighborhood where the incident had occurred began to see the first signs of change. People who had watched in silence now stepped forward, demanding reform and accountability. Local activists met with city council members, and protests, peaceful but powerful, filled the streets. The community, once divided in its thoughts, was now unified under one banner: justice. And the man, who had once been reduced to a victim, now stood as a pillar of hope, showing that one act of quiet courage could change an entire system. Back at his home, the man sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His phone buzzed with messages, but he didn't check it. He'd seen enough of the world's reactions for one day. It was time for his own quiet reflection. The weight of the past few days was heavy, but it didn't break him. Instead, it had solidified his understanding of what true power was. The power to choose how you respond in moments of injustice, the strength to turn adversity into opportunity, and the wisdom to know that real change starts with one voice standing firm. Weeks turned into months, and the department slowly began to show signs of change. The viral video had become more than just a moment of public outrage. It had sparked conversations that could no longer be ignored. The officers who had once acted on instinct were now learning to act with restraint and awareness. Their transformation wasn't instant, but it was real. It was in the way they spoke to citizens, the way they interacted with their colleagues, and most importantly, the way they saw themselves. They were no longer the enforcers of power. They were servants of the people. The man's voice had grown quieter, not out of defeat, but out of confidence. He knew his words carried weight. He had seen the transformation in his colleagues, in his city. Now, it was time for them to see it in themselves. Every day, his leadership echoed in the halls of the department, not as a voice of power, but as a voice of understanding. And when his officers asked him what had changed, he simply smiled and said, "You did. You listened. You chose to be better." In the community, things began to shift as well. The relationship between the police and the citizens they served was no longer defined solely by fear. The man's actions had created a ripple effect that reached every corner of the city. People who had once felt powerless now felt seen. The trust that had been broken was beginning to heal, and as it did, people found new ways to work together, to speak honestly, and to create a safer, more united city. The man's journey had not been an easy one, but it was one he had never walked alone. The support of his family, his colleagues, and his community had carried him through the hardest moment. He had known from the start that this wouldn't just be about correcting an isolated wrong. It would be about correcting a system that had allowed so many wrongs to go unchecked. And as the sun set on the city, he found peace in knowing that he had made a difference. Not because of the viral video, not because of the apology or the reprimand, but because he had chosen to lead with compassion and strength. The community's transformation wasn't just visible in the streets. It was in the small moments. A police officer helping a child with a broken bike, a teenager shaking hands with a patrol officer, a stranger nodding in passing. The tension that once hung heavy in the air had shifted to something lighter, something more hopeful. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The man, once a symbol of defiance, was now a symbol of hope. And as he looked out over his city, he knew one thing for sure. The change had come, and it was here to stay.